Hey y'all, welcome to episode 9 of Custom Card Reviews. This episode features dragons based on black holes, a hand trap archetype, and a dragon who will fight to prove he is number one.
He was number one!
As always, you can join the Discord chat with the link in the description to find a custom card community. Now let's jump in. This submission is by Slides. This is a fully custom archetype known as the Eclipse Dragons. Let's see what we got to work with. Starting off with Eclipse Dragon Lightbreaker. If you control no monsters, you can special summon this card from your hand. You can only use this effect of Eclipse Dragon Lightbreaker once per turn. If this card is sent from the field to the grave, you can target one card on the field and destroy it. Next up is Eclipse Dragon Shadow Scaler. If this card is normal or special summon, you can add one Eclipse Dragon spell trap card from your deck to your hand. You can banish this card from your grave, target one Eclipse Dragon monster in your grave except Eclipse Dragon Shadow Scaler and special summon it. You can only use this effect of the Shadow Scaler once per turn. Next up is Eclipse Dragon Twilight Summoner. If this card is normal or special summon, you can special summon one level 4 or lower Eclipse Dragon monster from your deck in defense position, except the Twilight Summoner. You can only use this effect of the Twilight Summoner once per turn. If this card is sent to the grave as a material for an Xyz summon, you can send one Eclipse Dragon monster from your deck to the grave. You can only use this effect of Twilight Summoner once per turn. If an Eclipse Dragon monster is special summoned to your field while this card is in your grave, you can banish this card, increase the attack of all Eclipse Dragon monsters you control by 500 until the end of this turn. Next is the Stellar Conqueror. When this card is normal or special summon, you can add one level 9 Eclipse Dragon monster from your deck to your hand, except the Stellar Conqueror. You can only use this effect once per turn. You can discard one Eclipse Dragon monster from your hand, special summon this card from your hand. You can only use this effect once per turn. While this card is on the field, all level 9 Eclipse Dragon monsters you control gain 500 attack. Now we get into the Xyz monster, starting off with Twilight Eclipse Ruby Dragon. The materials are 2 level 4 Eclipse Dragon monsters. Once per turn, you can detach one Xyz material from this card, add one Eclipse Dragon monster from your deck to your hand. If this card is sent from field to grave, you can banish one Eclipse Dragon monster from your grave, special summon this card from your grave in defense position. You can only use this effect once per turn. While this card is on the field, all other Eclipse Dragon monsters you control gain 500 attack. Next is Eclipse Dragon Sapphire. Its materials are 2 level 4 Eclipse Dragon monsters. Once per turn, you can detach one material from this card, special summon one Eclipse Dragon monster from your hand or grave. If you special summon from the grave, that monster's effects are negated until the end of the turn. If this card has no Xyz material, it cannot be destroyed by battle. This card gains 500 attack for each other Eclipse Dragon monster you control. Now we get into the boss, the Twilight Forest Eclipse Dragon. This is a rank 9 comprised of 2 level 9 Eclipse Dragon monsters. This card is always treated as an Eclipse Dragon monster, gains 2000 attack for each Eclipse Dragon monster in your grave, unaffected by your opponent's card effects. You can banish one Maiden of the Eclipse from your grave for the rest of the turn. This card can attack all monsters your opponent controls once each. During the end phase, if this card is in your grave because it was destroyed by battle or card effect this turn and sent there, you can banish one Eclipse Dragon monster from your grave and special summon it. Now moving in, one more monster. This is a Link Eclipse Dragon Diamond. Link 2. The materials are 2 Eclipse Dragon monsters. When this card is Link summoned, you can draw 2 cards. Once per turn, quick effect, you can negate the activation of a spell, trap card, or monster effect. If you do, this card gains 500 attack until the end of the turn. And all Eclipse Dragon monsters this card points to gains 300 attack and defense. Now moving into the spells and traps, starting off with Eclipse Dragon's Calls, a quick play spell. It says trap, but I think it's a quick play spell. Add one Eclipse Dragon monster from your deck to your hand. You can only activate one Eclipse Dragon's Call per turn. During either player's turn, if you control an Eclipse Dragon monster, you can activate this card from your hand. Immediately after this effect resolves, you can normal summon Eclipse Dragon monster in addition to your normal summon set. You can only gain this effect once per turn. Oh, went backward. Next up is Eclipse Dragon's Barrier, and this is the final card. This is a quick play trap. Haha. When your opponent activates a spell, trap card, or a monster effect, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that card. If you control an Eclipse Dragon monster, when you activate this card, you can banish one Eclipse Dragon monster from your grave. This card cannot be destroyed by card effects this turn. So I think that's referring to the Eclipse Dragon monster being referred to that you control when you activate it. Okay, so going back up to the top, starting off with the Lightbreaker. So these types of special summon from hand effects that don't use the chain, so their inherent special summoning abilities, they won't say you can only use the effect once per turn. What they'll say instead is that you can only special summon so-and-so once per turn this way. So that's just a quick correction there. As far as the other effect goes, the pop effect, so this is another one of those, that's probably fine. You just don't typically see such a powerful removal effect on a level 4 with such an easy condition. If anything, I would maybe change this to if it's sent from field to grave by battle or card effect, just so it can't be abused by all the the link in synchro summoning. But other than that, I think it's fine. One also small thing that, again, not meta breaking by any means, just I feel like this guy has really good stats for a level 4. Like, it's 1900 attack, 2300 defense. Usually it tends to be really high attack or really high defense, not both at the same time. So I would maybe just take that into consideration as well. Moving into the shadow scaler, so PSCT thing, the semicolon comes after targeting. So where it says here that you can banish this card from your grave, semicolon, target one Eclipse Dragon monster in your grave. What you would say instead is you can banish this card from your grave, then target one Eclipse Dragon monster in your grave, except the shadow scaler, semicolon, special summon it. So that's how that would work. The first effect, I would make it a hard once per turn. So typically when you have an effect, particularly a search effect that triggers on normal or special summon, that tends to be a hard once per turn effect. So what you could say here is just you can only use each effect of Eclipse Dragon Shadow Scaler once per turn, and you'd be fine with that. Moving into the Twilight Summoner, same point I've made in the past about special summoning from deck. This one is at least somewhat specific, where you have a level 4 lower Eclipse Dragon monsters, and there's not too many of those, but they do have pretty decent effects. But again, if you're summoning from the deck, there typically is involved with it a cost to do so, a specific condition to meet, or a restriction on the monster that you're summoning, or a restriction on what you can do for the rest of the turn. So for example, you can only summon Eclipse Dragon monsters for the rest of the turn if you use this effect, something like that. Second thing, like PSCT wise, you have 2 hard ones per turns here. You can consolidate it just to save some space. So what you wouldn't need it here, and then after this one, you could say you can only use the previous effects of Eclipse Dragon Twilight Summoner once per turn, or you can only use each of the previous effects of the Twilight Summoner once per turn, something like that. As far as the second effect goes, I don't quite get it. I think there's probably a misunderstanding here. So Xyz summons don't ever send materials to the grave, right? They get attached to the monster that you're summoning. So maybe figure out a different way to trigger this effect, or just don't have it there. Or since you have a Link monster, you could say if this card is sent to the grave as material for a Link summon, then you can trigger this effect. So just a few different options on how you want to go about fixing that. The last effect is good. It aligns with your goal, which seems to be just boosting up your monster's attack, particularly your Xyz monsters and that rank 9 boss. So that's all well and good. Moving into the Stellar Conqueror. So, small thing, and this is kind of a relic, I don't think I really see this too much anymore, where you have optional effects, so the you can, paired with a when condition. So the when condition and an optional is susceptible to missing the timing, which is something that you see a lot with older cards, and that's why nowadays when you have you can optional effects, they tend to say if this card is whatever, then in that way you won't miss the timing. And what missing the timing basically means is that if the trigger or condition for an effect is met during the middle of a chain, so it's not the last thing that happens on the chain, then that effect won't be able to activate on the ensuing chain. So basically, for example, if there was a chain link where this guy was special summoned on chain link 2, then there's still the matter of chain link 1 to resolve, and at that point this guy misses the timing. That happens if it's a when effect. If it's an if effect, then you don't have to worry about missing the timing. If it's a mandatory effect, you don't have to worry about missing the timing. And again, this seems to be a relic of the past, where nowadays any optional effect Konami prints tend to say if. So just a PSA for all custom card designers out there, just be wary about missing the timing. For the rest of the card, this another stat suggestion. I probably lowered this guy's attack to 3,000. There aren't too many super easily summonable monsters that effectively come out at 4,000 plus. Like this guy's already baseline 4,000 and then gains 500 because of he himself is a level 9. So he's going to come out at 4,500 if his effect isn't negated. The ones that tend to come out so easily, like Malefic Cyber End Dragon, for example, it will pop itself if you don't have a field spell. Or there's like some sort of drawback or negative effect or some sort of condition to meet to keep the guy on the field if he's so easily summonable with high attack. So that's just something to keep in mind there. I think you could easily fix that by lowering this guy's attack to 3,000, I think would be fine. Moving into the Xyz, so the Ruby Dragon, I think the hard ones for turns, so you can only use this effect once per turn. It needs to specify the name of the monster that you're referring to. So in this case, you can only use this effect of Twilight Eclipse Ruby Dragon once per turn. So you would be fine there. The other thing, I don't know if it's going to come back to bite you, but maybe just something to bear in mind. You could maybe make this an Eclipse Dragon monster. So by name right now, it's not. And that's something that maybe it might, maybe you did that intentionally, maybe not. I'm just pointing it out. The Sapphire, I think this card is perfectly fine. No issues with this card. Has your little boosting for your boss monsters. It's got that, got the recursion effects, so all good here. And then the rank 9. So a few things about the rank 9. From what I see, the only level 9 you have is Conqueror, and that kind of flipped my mind here a second. You can, when this card is normal special summon, you can add one level 9 Eclipse Dragon monster from your deck to your hand, except the Stellar Conqueror. There are no other level 9s. So maybe you have some that you didn't include in the submission, and then that's fine. But basically what my recommendation here is to have at least one other level 9 so you can get the search with Conqueror, and so you have more options to make this guy. So the Conqueror himself isn't too hard to summon, but he's hard to get multiple copies in your hand, and then you'd have to discard one card for each. So you're giving up 2 cards to bring them out to then go into this guy. So all that is to say, add some more level 9s, make it easier for you to bring this guy out. Alternatively, what you could do is have effects that boost your level 4s to level 9s, or the third option is to give this guy an alternate summoning condition where you can stack it on top of one of your rank 4s and it'll absorb its materials, and then you can bring it out that way. So any of those options would be fine. As far as the effect goes, the 2000 attack boost is just way too much. Those stat boosts that look at cards in your grave tend to be very tame, so they're usually like in that 100, 200, 300 range. I think 200 here would probably be fine. The effect about Maiden of the Eclipse, so again, another example of a card that may have not been included in the submission. So this, I searched it, it's not a card that exists, so I'm assuming it's a custom card, and I just don't know what it looks like, so I have no idea what kind of interactions it has or how it gets to the grave, if it interacts by being banished, if it does anything in the banishment. So just not fully able to score this card without knowing what that card looks like. The unaffected by opponent's card effect. So last thing I'll say about this card. So this is a very specific and powerful protection that is more than just rare. Like, it's almost never seen and almost always requires some condition to be fulfilled, or it is granted by another card. This card isn't super easy to bring out for reasons mentioned earlier, but if you do resolve those reasons, then this card may be very easy to bring out. So if you fix that, if the ability to bring it out, then I would consider changing up this protection to be a little less encompassing. So maybe it just has targeting and destruction protection. I think that's more par for the course as opposed to unaffected by opponent's card effects. Maybe you could also say unaffected by all effects except its own, so it'll still gain its boost. So those are some options there. And then you could also make it conditional. So for example, if you lower the boost here from 2000 to 200, then you could have it so this card is unaffected by your opponent's card effects if its attack is 5000 or greater. In that case, you would need 5 Eclipse Dragons, and then you would reach that, as well as the other boost abilities that are out there in your archetype. So once it gets to a certain attack level, then it gets that protection. So that's another way to go about it. All right, moving into the diamond. I'm not a fan of the easy draw 2 here. Draw 1, maybe, but I'd like to see this more conditional, like draw cards equal to the number of Eclipse Dragon monsters it points to. So something like that. The negation effect just needs to specify at what point it can activate. It's kind of implied that you're going for when your opponent activates a spell, trap card, or monster effect, but that needs to be specified, because what you could have alternatively have been going for here is that you can just negate the activation, right? So maybe, yeah, you just need to specify when your opponent activates a spell, trap card, or monster effect, quick effect, you can negate the activation. If you do, this card gains 500 attack until the end of this turn. It's like there was a typo there, just missing the word turn. And then the boost effect is fine. All right, moving into the spell. So kind of like what I pointed out, this sets trap. But it looks like a spell. I'm guessing it is supposed to be a spell. My bigger question about this card though is how the second effect works. So you can activate it from your hand. So that I'm guessing what you mean to do by that is that you get the search of its effect, and then afterward after it resolves, you can normal summon an Eclipse Dragon monster. So you can theoretically summon the one that you just searched. 2 things. You never have. We've never seen a spell that can be activated from your hand, presumably on your opponent's turn. So that's something to keep in mind. If you wanted to change it to a trap, that would make more sense. Otherwise, I would just simplify this to say add one blah blah blah. Then if you activated this card while you controlled an Eclipse Dragon monster, immediately after this effect resolves, you can normal summon Eclipse Dragon. So an Eclipse Dragon monster in addition to your normal summon set. So I think that is fine. Also, maybe wording wise, you don't need this part here in addition to your normal summon set. You can just say immediately after this effect resolves, you can normal summon one Eclipse Dragon monster, and that's it. And then what you could do, well, you already have it. You can only activate one Eclipse Dragon's call per turn, so you'd be fine on the hard ones per turn gaining of that effect anyways. And then finally, the trap. Again, yeah, says trap, has a quick play icon. I imagine that this one is actually supposed to be a trap. This negation is very, very generic and very, very powerful. When your opponent activates a spell, trap card, or a monster effect, negate the activation if you do destroy that card. So it's just like Solemn Judgment negates spell, trap cards, and summons, but at the cost of half your life points. This guy just negates any spell, trap card, or monster effect without any sort of cost attached. So I would either give it a cost or, more preferably, make it conditional so that it's specific to your archetype. Like if you control an Eclipse Dragon monster, if you control a Dragon Xyz monster, or something like that. As far as the second effect goes, like I had mentioned as I was reading it, I think what you mean by here with this protection effect is that it is referencing the Eclipse Dragon monster that you control at the time of the activation. So maybe what you could do instead is something like Prologue of the Destruction Swordsman, where you can banish it from your grave, and for that turn, Eclipse Dragon monsters, or maybe more specifically, Dragon Xyz monsters, can be destroyed by battle or card effects, or in this case, by card effects for the rest of the turn. So something like that would be sufficient for what you're going for. All right, moving into the grading. So the design, I give a 5. You have a basic premise here to pump out these dragon bosses that gain a bunch of attack, which I think you largely do well. It works well like that. The creativity, I give a 4. Nothing groundbreaking here, just a overall smooth operation, so that works out. And then the balance, I give it a 7. Just a couple of stat modulations and maybe watering down how the boss gets its protections, but otherwise seems pretty balanced to me. And with a 547, that gives the deck an average score of 5.3. Thank you, Slides, for your submission. This submission is by Tenma. This is the Helios archetype. This is inspired by Bakugan, so let's check it out. Starting off with the figurehead of the deck, Helios. This is a normal dragon monster, level 8 fire, 3000 attack, 2800 defense. A dragon who will fight to prove he is number 1. All right, we'll see about that. Moving on into Phantom Helios, going into the effect monsters. Now, if this card's attack is higher than its original attack, then this card cannot attack your opponent directly. If this card attacks or is attacked, you can discard one card from your hand to increase this card's attack and defense by 1000. You can only use this effect of Phantom Helios once per turn. When this card is destroyed by your opponent, battle or card effect, add one Helios or a card that mentions Helios from your deck to your hand. Next up is Helios Core. During their next turn after this card was summoned, you can release this monster to special summon one Helios monster from the deck. So for those unfamiliar, release is the OCG equivalent of tributing it. So you tribute this monster to special summon one Helios from the deck. Once per turn, quick effect until the end phase, you can double this card's level, attack, and defense. So that would bring it up to 1500 attack, 1200 defense, and 8 stars. Next up is Metal Fencer. This is a level 6 Union monster. If you control Helios, you can special summon this card from your hand. Also has the effect of unionizing, so it'll equip to the monster. It doesn't have the de-equip effect, so more on that in a second. But it'll equip to the monster a face of Helios, and it'll grant it 600 attack, 500 defense, and can attack twice per battle phase. Next up is Cyber Helios MK1, the Razor. Cannot be normal summoned or set, must first be special summoned from the hand by sending Helios from your hand or field to the grave. You can only special summon one Cyber Helios MK1, the Razor, once per turn. This way, once per turn, you can destroy one card on the field. If this card leaves the field, special summon one level 8 or one level 8 normal Helios monster from the grave. Now we get into the boss, Cyber Helios MK2, the Dominator. The materials are 1 Helios plus 3 Union machine-type monsters with different names. You can also special summon this monster by sending one Cyber Helios MK1, the Razor you control, to the grave. If this card were to be destroyed or banished by an opponent's card effect, you can remove from play one spell card from your opponent's graveyard instead. If this card battles an opponent's monster, you can decrease that monster's attack and defense by 1000. If this card is destroyed by battle, you can special summon one level 8 Helios monster from the graveyard. Going into the spells now with Farbus. It's a quick play spell. When a Cyber Helios MK monster you control is destroyed by battle, you can special summon that monster. When a Helios effect monster you control will be destroyed by card effect while this card is in the grave, you can banish this card to negate that card effect. Next up is General Quasar. Is a normal spell. Target one level 8 or higher Helios monster you control. Inflict damage to your opponent equal to half of that monster's attack. Then you can destroy one monster your opponent controls whose attack or defense is equal to or less than the damage you have taken from this card's effect. You can only use General Quasar once per turn. And then finally, for the spells is Farbus EM, a quick play spell. You can target one Cyber Helios MK monster you control. It cannot be destroyed by battle or card effects this turn. Then increase that monster's attack and defense by 500. If a Cyber Helios MK monster attack or defense is different than its original value, you can banish this card from your grave to return that monster's attack and defense to its original value. Finally, we have the Trap Helios Warzone. Normal trap, target one level 8 or higher Helios monster you control. When that monster battles an opponent's monster, cut that monster's attack or defense in half, then increase the attack of this card's target by the amount lost. If this card is in the grave while you took damage involving a Helios monster, you can banish this card, except the turn it was sent, to destroy one card your opponent controls, or as the wording says, on your opponent's field. Alright, so that does it for the rundown. Let's go back up to the top. So, starting off with the namesake. I was wondering how long it would take for something like this app. So, in your submission, you mentioned that this guy rivals Blue Eyes. That's all well and good. You can't do this. It's basically Yu-Gi-Oh! Blasphemy to have any normal monster have 3,000 or more attack. The only one that's allowed to is Blue Eyes and then the Blackluster Soldier. These are rules that are followed both by Konami and really custom card creators alike. So I would highly recommend that at best this guy have 2950, maybe make it 2900 for easier math. Whatever it may be, it can't be 3000. And that way, he really does have to prove himself to be number one, because just by attack values, he would not be. So that's just my recommendation there. Moving on to Phantom Helios. So this is a level 4 2000 attack monster that can easily bump up to 3000. And so this is, again, one of those feedback points that isn't necessarily about meta relevance, but more so about principle, which is that generally level 4 monsters that have 2000 or higher attack tend to have some sort of drawback effect. Now, this one sort of has a drawback where you can't attack with him directly if his attack is higher than his original attack, but the fact that he immediately can and then bump up to 3000, it's just, again, more of a principle thing than a meta relevance thing. I think it would behoove you to lower this guy's attack to maybe something like 1500, and then maybe that'll be fine. Going into the core, I think you should specify here at what point exactly during the next turn this effect activates, because right now it just says during the next turn. So it kind of reads like it's going to be an ignition effect on your turn as long as it has survived a turn, but maybe what you could do instead to really help it trigger so it doesn't have to survive so many turns is that you just stipulate the activation point so you can trigger during your opponent's turn. So for example, you normal summon this guy, and then during the standby phase after this, if this card was summoned the previous turn, or if this card has been on the field for at least a turn, you can tribute it to special summon Helios from the deck. Something like that would work out well for it. Going into the Metal Fencer, so like I mentioned earlier, this doesn't have the de-equip effect. So what I would recommend here is look at a typical Union monster and see what the wording is like for how it unionizes and deunionizes, and just copy that. Otherwise, the effects on this card are fine. Cyber Helios is fine. I think it's your mini boss of the deck. I think it works well for the deck. Has that nice little floating effect to go back into the OG. And then your fusion monsters. So I'm guessing you have some more archetype Union monsters that are not in the submission. You did mention in your submission that there are more cards than this. So that's where I'm guessing you have some of those other Union machine monsters, or maybe you're creating a hybrid build with some of the other vast pool of Union machine monsters already out there. So, but if there are more in your archetype, then that could really help me understand how easily this guy can be brought out. Because if I remember correctly, there wasn't even a fusion summoning capability for this card. So other than that alternate summoning condition, I don't know if there is another way to bring it out in your archetype. But overall, I think this card works well as the boss of the deck. So moving into the spells, this is a solid card, Farbus. Might even expand on it to include any level 8 or higher Helios monster, just so there's more options to work with. Right now, it only works on Cyber Helioses, so maybe work with any level 8 Helios. The next card, General Quasar, I think is a solid card. It's a overall good effect. Farbus EM, quick play spell. So this is a for this card, you can change this then to an also. So in this case, you would grant it that battle and card effect destruction protection, and then you also get the 500 attack and defense boost. The den tends to be, it is, where you have one effect and then another effect on top of that. So I don't think in this, like those effects follow, like where the den effect can only take place if that first effect takes place. So I don't think this is one of those situations where you really need a then. You could just do and, or you could do also. So in the case of also, if one of the effects is negated, then the other effect would still go through. The second effect, I'm not too sure about the second effect. So the only monsters I saw in here that would benefit from having their attack restored to their original value is Phantom Helios. Just because then you can attack directly with them. But he's not even a valid target for this because it's specifically for Cyber Helioses. So I think you could just fit in a different effect here to make it more worthwhile. And then the War Zone, I would specify here that this effect applies for that turn, and then specify the condition of the activation. So it could be like when you're during the battle involving a Helios monster, or you can just activate it whenever and target a Helios monster like you do. And if it battles that turn, then the opponent's monster's attack and defense are halved, something like that. Otherwise, the card is fine. So moving on into the grading design, I give it a 4. I don't really see too much flow or interaction between the cards. That said, I understand again that there is more to this archetype than just the 10 cards that we looked at. So that could easily explain why it just feels a bit lacking, but I'll leave the design here at a 4. The creativity, I give a 3, similar point above. Maybe I just don't have the full story, but as it stands, it's an archetype of powering up big dragons, which is basically Yu-Gi-Oh! Circa 2002. So I think you could improve a bit more on the creativity. Kind of like in previous showcases, I do try to give bonus points for adaptations. I'm not familiar myself with Bakugan, so I can't really give any bonus points on that. And for the balance, I give it a 6. And you might think, well, what's broken about this? Nothing, really. But I'll go the other way and say that this archetype may have too much trouble in 2024. Even someone like me who hard disagrees with the direction of the game will still concede that there is at least some merit to speed and combos. And I think this deck is just sitting at pre-2008 levels. So the balance, it's underbalanced. Like, you need to boost up the power level of this. And that kind of goes back to the design points I made, that there just needs to be more flow and more combo potential with the deck. So with the 436, that gives the deck an average score of 4.3. Thank you, Tenma, for your submission. This submission is by Requiem. This is the custom Celestial archetype, an archetype based on hand trap monsters to disrupt the opponent by summoning themselves to the opponent's side of the field. Let's see what we got. Starting with Celestial Spirit Akechi Mitsuhide. Probably gonna mispronounce some of these names. When your opponent special summons an extra deck monster, quick effect, you can tribute it. Special summon this card from your hand to your opponent's field in the same zone that monster was summoned to. Once per turn, you can target one Celestial Spirit monster in your grave or your opponent's field, special summon it to your field, but you must use that monster as synchro material. Otherwise, it is banished face down at the end of the turn. If this card is used as synchro material for the synchro summon of a Celestial Spirit monster, that synchro summon monster cannot be tributed until the end of your opponent's next turn. Next up is Celestial Spirit Hattori Hanzo. Quick effect, you can special summon this card to your opponent's field and send one random card from your opponent's hand to the grave, ignoring any effects that may activate by being sent to the grave. Once per turn, you contribute this card from either side of the field, special summon one Celestial Spirit monster from your grave or opponent's field. Next is Celestial Spirit Mori Ranmaru. When your opponent activates a card effect that allows them to special summon a banished monster or a monster from the grave, quick effect, negate the activation, then special summon this card to your opponent's field. While this card is on your opponent's field, all Celestial Spirit monsters you control cannot be destroyed by battle. Once per turn, when your opponent declares an attack, quick effect, you contribute this card from your opponent's field, negate the attack. Additionally, you can special summon one Celestial Spirit monster from your grave or hand to your field, except Mori. Next, we have Celestial Spirit Nobunaga Oda. The Pendulum effect is a scale of 4. The effect is, while this card is in your Pendulum zone, all Celestial Spirit monsters you control gain 500 attack and defense and count as both tuners and non-tuners. And then the second effect is you can destroy this monster in your Pendulum zone. Take control of as many Celestial Spirit monsters that your opponent controls as possible, but destroy them during the end phase. Then both players lose life points equal to the number of monsters destroyed times 400. As far as its monster effect goes, you can special summon this card while your opponent controls at least 2 monsters, including at least 1 Celestial Spirit monster. If you do, you can reduce this card's attack to 2500 and its level to 6. Second, while this card is on your opponent's field, all Celestial Spirit monsters you control gain 300 attack and defense. And third, once per turn when your opponent activates a card effect that would destroy at least one card you control, quick effect, you can negate the activation of that effect and if possible, destroy that card. Additionally, you can special summon up to 3 Celestial Spirit monsters from your grave or hand to your field, except Nobunaga. Next is Celestial Spirit Nohimi. Pendulum effect. This is a scale of 2. It's pendulum effect. Once per turn, you can add 1 Celestial Spirit spell trap from your deck to your hand. You can send this card from your pendulum zone to your grave. Monsters you control whose levels are higher than this monster's pendulum scale cannot be affected by card effects until the end of your opponent's next turn. And then this monster effect. During your main phase, if your opponent activates an effect that would either prevent you from using one of your spell trap zones or destroy a spell trap you control, quick effect, you can special summon this card from your hand to your opponent's field. You can only use this effect of Celestial Spirit Nohimi once per turn. If this card is special summoned to your opponent's field, it can be used as material for a synchro summon of a Celestial Spirit synchro monster. And finally, once per turn, if this card is on your field, you can banish 1 Celestial Spirit monster from your grave, inflict damage to your opponent equal to that monster's original attack. Next up is Celestial Spirit Tokugawa Ieyasu. When your opponent activates a monster effect, quick effect, negate the activated monster effect and destroy that monster, then special summon this card to your opponent's field. While this card is on your opponent's field, all Celestial Spirit monsters you control cannot be targeted by your opponent's card effects. Once per turn, quick effect, you contribute this card from your opponent's field, negate the activation of a spell trap card and destroy it. Then special summon 1 Celestial Spirit monster from your grave or hand to your field, except Tokugawa. Now we have Celestial Spirit Oichi. So as you see there in the corner, this should be an effect monster. It was erroneously printed as a ritual. So if you get your hands on this, it might be worth an extra buck. Pendulum effect. It's a scale of 9. Pendulum, if this monster on your opponent's field would be used as materials for the summon of an extra deck monster, you can place it in one of your pendulum zones. Once per turn, you can target 1 monster on the field, change it to a tuner, and if you do, you can change its level to anywhere between 1 and 8, assuming that's also inclusive of 1 and 8. As far as the monster effects go, during your main phase, if your opponent activates an effect that would either prevent you from using one of your monster zones or destroy a monster you control, quick effect, you can special summon this card from your hand. You can only use this effect of Celestial Spirit Oichi once per turn. If this card is special summoned to your opponent's field, it can be used as material for a synchro summon of a Celestial Spirit synchro monster. Once per turn, during the standby phase of the turn after this card was special summoned to your opponent's field, return this card to your grave. When a synchro monster you control would leave the field, you can special summon this card from your grave but banish it when it leaves the field. Now we get to the boss of the deck, the Synchro monster, who is also a pendulum, Divine Celestial Spirit Nobunaga, the Unifier, scale of 10. The pendulum effect, if this monster is face up in your extra deck, you can place it into one of your empty pendulum zones. You can destroy 1 Celestial Spirit monster you control in your pendulum zone, add 1 Celestial Spirit monster from your deck to your hand. If this card is in your pendulum zone and you control no monsters, you can special summon this card to your field. Monster effect, its materials are 1 tuner and 1 or more non-tuners. Celestial Spirit monsters you control gain 500 attack and defense. You can activate the following effects of the Celestial Spirit once per turn. During your main phase 1, you can special summon up to 3 Celestial Spirit monsters from your grave but negate their effects. And once per turn, quick effect, you can target 1 face-up card your opponent controls, negate its effects, and if the target is a monster, its attack defense becomes 0. These changes last until the end of your opponent's turn. Alright, so that was an all monster lineup, no spells and traps, so let's go back up to the top. Alright, starting off with some general points. So since the basic gimmick of this deck is to place monsters on your opponent's field, just need to understand a basic principle that whoever is the controller of the monster, if that monster references the opponent, then it is the person who is not the controller of that monster. So a lot of these where you say, like the card text mentions your opponent controls it, well, if your opponent controls it, then at that point, you're the opponent of that monster. So that's just a basic fundamental thing that we need to keep in mind when designing effects that are working off of your opponent controlling these monsters. And then the second aspect of that is that you can't activate the effects of monsters your opponent controls. So you would need some effect on your side of the field, like a pendulum effect or a field spell or something to allow you to do so. And then as for continuous effects, these are a bit more easier to reword. You just need to have it so that they are effects that apply to the opponent, because while your opponent controls your monster, again, you are now the opponent of that monster. So just understanding that fundamental point will help you reword some of these effects to make sure that they're doing what you want them to do. Second thing, there are certain types of effects that tend to have hard once per turns, and I didn't really see too many of those. So for example, monsters that search on special summon, they tend to have hard once per turns nowadays. Another common effect that almost always has a hard once per turn is effects that summon a monster from your hand. So anything that self-summons itself, whether that be you can only summon it once this way or you can only use that effect once per turn. So just bear those in mind, those types of expectations in mind as you design those effects and make sure that those hard once per turn stipulations are added. Third thing, you have a couple of effects where you special summon from the grave or your opponent's field. The latter just needs to be reworded so that you're taking control of it. I don't know of any, other than Gemini monsters, which kind of summon themselves again to turn them from normal to effect. There isn't really an aspect of the game where you're summoning monsters that are already on the field. So if you're taking an opponent's monster, then you just reword it to take control of. Fourth thing, and this just a little known rule, so there's no such thing as destroying cards for cost. So destruction is always part of effect. So you saw as we go through, you have a few destruction that are preceding a semicolon, which would indicate that it is part of the effect that is happening at activation, i.e. a cost of sorts. So just keep that in mind, destruction is never part of cost. And then the fifth thing, some cards just have too many words. A number of these eclipse well over 150. I understand that a couple of these are pendulums, but even so, that's a lot of words. My basic guideline here is that non-boss monsters should typically have 1 to 2 effects, and boss monsters can have more depending on how hard they are to bring out. That isn't to say that they all have to be under 3 effects or something. That it just kind of goes on a card-by-card basis and what the archetype needs, but just more of a general principle to follow to make sure that people are more easily able to understand and learn the archetype you've created, and honestly no one wants to read a bunch of text. So those are just some general feedbacks to keep in mind. Now we can jump into the monster lineup. So starting off with Akechi. So effects that activate in response to summons are just, they're not quick effects, they're trigger effects. So you wouldn't need to specify here that it's a quick effect. It would just trigger at the time that your opponent summons a monster. Other that aside, this card is wildly powerful. Easily something I could see any deck running as a hand trap because it tributes as a cost to remove a threat in a trigger / quick effect fashion. You need to find a way to make this archetype specific, and that should likely involve making the condition for its activation much more difficult to meet, because otherwise any deck could run this, and they probably would. And then the other effect, it's one of those effects that special summons a monster from your opponent's field, so that's kind of what I was talking about. You would just reword that to be taking control of an opponent's monster. Moving on to Hattori. So again, another one, not as powerful, but still pretty powerful generic hand trap where other decks could use it. So just keep that in mind. Again, maybe try to find a way to make it more archetype specific. And here, another one of those effects where you special summon a monster from your opponent's field, so reward that to taking control of. Mori. So this one is also a generic hand trap, but at least it's reasonable in my opinion. The condition is specific enough, and the trade-off is giving your opponent a level 4 monster, so I think that's fine. The second effect is what I'm talking about with regard to rewording how continuous effects apply. If your opponent controls it, it's their effect. So it should say maybe something like Celestial Spirit monsters your opponent controls cannot be destroyed by battle, and so it would apply to the Celestial Spirit monsters that you control. The third effect is what I'm talking about with regard to activating effects your opponent controls. Again, you'd either need a card that you control to allow you to trigger this effect, or perhaps you could reword it to something like when you declare an attack with another monster you control, tribute this card and negate that attack. So now it's basically a mandatory effect that your opponent has to activate at the point that they try to declare an attack with another monster while they control this one. Moving on to Nobunaga, the aspect that it counts both monsters that you control as both tuners and non-tuners might be a challenge. It just, in my head, since the vast majority of synchros specify using a non-tuner as material, could you actually use a non-tuner that is also being treated as a tuner? Like, I guess a similar equivalence would be if a required material was a non-wind monster, could you use a monster on the field that was being treated as both a light and a wind, or a dark and a wind? I don't know for certain, so I'm not going to say one way or another, but I imagine this has come up at some point, so it's probably worth looking into. I myself couldn't find any specific ruling about it. The second pendulum effect is what I mentioned about destruction not being a cost, so that's just something to clean up there. Second, monster effects. So moving into the monster effects, just need to reword to something like Celestial Spirit monsters your opponent controls gain 300 attack and defense. So again, since they control it, you are now the opponent, so your Celestial Spirit monsters will gain that boost. And then the last effect, the +3 special summon on the last effect just seems a bit over the top. I would consider lowering that to 1. Moving on to Nohimi. Without having all the pendulum effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! Memorized. I don't know of any off the top of my head that grant you a search without either a cost condition or destroying the pendulum card itself. So you do that a little bit later on with one of yours, but this one is just a free search on a turn-by-turn basis, so I don't think that's par for the course. I would include a cost condition or destruction of the pendulum card. The first monster effect, I imagine you meant to include here that the opponent's effect is negated as a result, because right now you just have it special summoning to your opponent's field. I imagine you wanted to negate the thing that it is responding to. The second effect, again, the convention to abide by is that effects belong to the controller of the card, so I understand what you're going for here. You could maybe reword this to, like, the owner of this card can use it as synchro material for the synchro summon of a celestial spirit synchro monster, even if their opponent controls this card. So something like that. Moving on to Tokugawa. This one is back to being a generic hand trap, though I think this one may also be fine. It's a bit weaker of a Ghost Ogre, though Ghost Ogre could only destroy monsters that are on the field. This could theoretically negate any monster effect no matter where it's activating, so it is a bit stronger in that regard, but I don't think it would. Well, I don't know. I'll let other people decide. I still think other folks would generally prioritize Imperm and maybe even Ghost Ogre over this card. The other effect, same point about rewording how the second effects would look since it's your opponent who controls it, so that's something to keep in mind there. And then the other effect, same point about not being able to activate the effect of a card your opponent controls. You could likely go with mandatory activation here as well, like I mentioned with Mori, or have an effect on a card you control that allows you to tribute celestial spirit monsters your opponent controls to trigger certain effects. So there's a few different ways to go about it, just not the way that it is currently written, because again, if a card references the opponent, then it is the opponent of the player who doesn't control it at that point in time. Moving into Oichi, I'm not sure how this pendulum effect works, because if it's somehow gotten to your opponent's pendulum zone, which I'm not sure how you would even get it there, but if it did, how would you use it as synchro material? So that's just a bit of confusion there. Moving into the monster effect. So first monster effect, same point as Nohimi. I imagine you meant to include that this would negate that opponent's effect, so not just summoning itself to the opponent's field, but it also negates the effect that prevents you from using your monster zone or destroying a monster you control. The second effect, again, another point where you just need to reward it, like with my recommendation on Nohimi. And then the last point on the last effect, you just need to specify how exactly this triggers. So basically, a card can't refer to itself as being on the opponent's field, because whoever field it's on, the field is it's not on the opponent's field, unless. Yeah, I can't think of any other way around that. So where it says once per turn during the standby phase of the turn after this card was supposed to summon to the opponent's field, return this card to your grave. So again, just reword it. One thing that'll probably come in handy for you, and I kind of mentioned it earlier, is using the term owner. So owner is always going to refer to the person who came into the duel with that card. They're the owner of the one who actually, like, outside of the duel owns that card. So that's something to maybe help you reword some of these things. Controller refers to whoever has it on their field, and then possess, I believe, includes just having it anywhere on their hand, banishment, graveyard, deck, and field would be the term of possess. So I believe that's the three tiers. You have control, you have possess, you have ownership. So those are the three terms you want to play around with to figure out how to make this deck properly function. And then moving into the Celestial Spirits or your boss. So the Pendulum effect, the second effect, again, same point, you can't have destruction as a cost, but that said, this is more like what I'm talking about as far as how Pendulum search effects tend to go, where you have some sort of trade-off involved. So in this case, you're popping a Celestial Spirit monster in your Pendulum zone to then get a search of a Celestial Spirit from your deck. As far as the monster effect goes, again, I think overall this card is fine. I'm still a bit more apprehensive to a triple special summon, so maybe lower that to 2. It is a boss monster, so it could be better. Like the main deck monster, I think you can lower to 1, and then this one you can keep at 2. Maybe 3 is fine too. It just kind of depends on how it tests, but that's just my overall. I think the boss is fine. So moving on to the grading, I give the design a 3. Now I say 3, but this can easily be fixed. A few cards here I think are just too generic and could be exploited by other decks. A number of cards have way too much text, and then the overall gimmick of the deck doesn't properly reference how the effects of cards that you own, that your opponent controls, would apply. So you're going for a pretty, I don't want to say convoluted, but just something that doesn't that has some sort of intricacies here and there. So just making sure you understand the wording and being able to communicate how the effects function, that all goes into the design grading of these reviews. So again, I say 3, but it could easily be bumped up once you get some of those things resolved. Creativity, I give a 4. So it's taking a modern concept of hand traps and turning it into an archetype by taking advantage of placing monsters on your opponent's field. So neither of these concepts is novel by itself, but together it's a little bit of a creative twist. And then balance, I give a 5. Nothing really jumped out to me as overly broken besides Akechi, though there is still some cleanup needed on cards like Hattori and those effects that allow you to mass special summon with ease. So that's a 3, 4, 5, and that gives the archetype an overall score of 4. Thank you, Requiem, for your submission.